The national media thinks Washington is trending up ahead of the 2025 season.
You are Locked On Huskies, your daily podcast on the Washington Huskies, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back into another edition of the Locked On Huskies podcast. I'm Roman Tomashoff. That's Lars Hanson. He writes with me over at Huskies Wire. Thank you for making this your first watch or first listen of the day, as we are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Football season is around the corner. Visit the FanDuel app today and start planning your futures bets now. And just a quick reminder to all you everydayers out there, wherever you get this podcast, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, make sure to click that subscribe button down below. Click that little bell as well so you never miss when we post a new show. Plus, if you're on the audio-only side of things, please make sure to leave us a 5-star review, as all that really does help the channel out a lot. Now, Lars, one thing that we've seen a whole lot of in recent days is some of the top prospects in the 2027 class are setting unofficial game day visits for this fall. So later on in the show, we're going to go through the defense and offensive guys that we maybe haven't given a whole lot of mention to just yet, that we know are at or near the top of Washington's board in that class. But we want to do that after something that you and I have predicted for a little while on this show, where people are believing that Washington is ready to take that step forward in 2025. One of them being Bruce Feldman, who believes that Washington is going to beat Oregon this fall.
Not alone in that respect when you go back and look at our preseason predictions, if you will. But again, when you think about that Oregon game, obviously it was great fodder on Twitter, but there is a case to be made. Like, Demond is the more experienced quarterback going into that game, no matter who's the starter for Oregon. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. I don't think Austin's starting.
I mean, if you take in Dante Moore's UCLA experience, not really, but in terms of in their current offenses, yes.
And I think that's more so what matters in this situation. And this would be the year where Oregon is, kind of in that, not rebuilding year, but in that Ohio State year where they're gettable. They're way more gettable than they were last year. Like, if we're talking about this game last year, again, like we said, probably going to be kind of ugly. And, you have a good freshman quarterback and all that. But now that Demond is another year older, Denzel is back, Jonah's back, the offense is intact, and the defense is improved. I think it's a legitimate case to be made.
Absolutely, where he's not alone, where there have been several other just media podcasters. I know the Cover 3 podcast did their preseason predictions. I've seen a couple other ones as well, where it's, hey, we think Washington's going to hit their over in wins, which is set at 7.5. According to our good friends over at FanDuel, I think that, Washington might hit 9, 10. I know you had them at 10 wins in our preseason record predictions. And it's something that, you and I have been saying throughout the summer is we're going to get to this point in the season, or in the offseason, really, and people are going to start catching on to what Jedd Fisch is building. And I think you did a really good job of describing all that, because it isn't just what Demond brings to the table. Jonah, Coleman, and Denzel Boston, a pair of preseason All-Americans. And I feel like, we're getting to the point in the offseason where people just want football to start and they want to see it on the field, which we couldn't agree more. That's where we are too. But there has to be a point where people just stop looking at some of these recruiting rankings, stop looking at whatever else it might be, and just look at what Washington's roster is, especially compared to where it was last season, and just say, top to bottom, this is much better than it was. There are so many things about this roster. I really do believe it's every single position has improved from where it was last year. I think the only one you can say where it stayed stagnant is running back, because the only additions were true freshmen and guys that probably aren't going to play this year. But I look at what Jedd Fisch and Matt Doherty and this entire coaching staff have done to build up this roster. And I think it's one that can legitimately compete in the Big Ten. We aren't going to see those blowout games that we did last year, because, I see it from Oregon fans, especially, who love to just get mad anytime somebody says something remotely positive about Washington. And it's, there's no all Big Ten caliber player on their defensive line. I think you and I believe there are a couple of guys with that potential. But like we've talked about so much, it's about what this coaching staff adds to that, what Ryan Walters brings with, this bear front, this 5-down look, where it's going to be just so much better at creating pressure in the backfield. It's going to be so much better at stopping the run with some of the guys they brought in, like Alex McLaughlin and CJ Christian, to play safety, who can walk down to the box and play some linebacker as well. With everything this team is going to be able to do in the front seven as well, there's enough talent there where we've said it. It's not going to be, 15th of the Big Ten in rushing yards allowed to 3rd or 4th. If they get there, great. But if it's 7, 8, 9, 10, somewhere in that just ballpark of average to maybe a little bit above average, maybe even a little below average in some different points and just some different metrics, this is still going to be a much improved team from where it was last season.
I mean, there's no question, size-wise, talent-wise, everything projectably has improved. But I think there is still some, again, just to not push back, because against the one of us who picked them to go 10-2, I'm obviously not backtracking on my prediction, but just worth the conversation of, I can at least, understand why some people are still hesitant, because
Absolutely.
We haven't seen Damon start a full season. And those guys have been available to practice every day, and we've seen Damon get better. We've seen him, make those throws at all 3 levels. So we know he can do it against UW in practice. Can he carry that over to a game? The one thing I think that you also hit on that is worth noting, Jedd Fisch, he's not really being the salesman that we normally expect him to be. He's kind of letting it seem to grow organically. And I think that's unique, because I wonder, where does Jedd Fisch grow the most this season? Where does he take that play calling improvement? Is it in the red zone? Is it just using Damon in certain ways? And I think that's kind of where this 10-2, 9-3 barrier, kind of is.
No, absolutely. And I think that's where it has to be, is in the red zone, because one thing that, you and I have touched on throughout the summer as we've just kind of seen this team grow and improve is the offensive line has gotten better. And a lot like with the front seven, with the defensive line, it doesn't all of a sudden need to be elite for everything in this offense to work. It needs to be passable. It needs to be average. And again, you're more than happy with going above average, but getting to one of these elite offensive lines, which, maybe in a couple of years, we'll see this group turn into that with young projectable players like John Mills, like Paki Finau. There are so many guys in this group that you can look at and get excited about for not just this season, but for 2-3 years to come, and where they might go. And we might see just the start of that, the foundation of that this season. And so much of what this team is coming back to that, because we've seen Jedd Fisch take these improvements, from year over year at Arizona, where it was a 1-win team his first season, to 5 wins in his second year, to 10 in his third season, where I don't think projecting a jump forward for Washington is that crazy to say, after 6 and 7 and being 3-4 plays away from being 8-4, regardless of the outcome of the bowl game. There are so many things to look at with this team and say, yeah, this makes sense. This can improve here. This can improve there. And I quite frankly am excited to get to the season, because there's just so many things that we can look at, even in a game against Colorado State, who I think is going to be one of the better group of 5 teams this season, or even against UC Davis, and just say, we've seen the progression of this unit in this area or that area. And I think this can be a really fun season for Washington. And it's cool to see the national media picking up on that.
And it's worth noting the schedule lines up way more favorably. You have Ohio State at home. You have Illinois at home and Oregon at home. The true test is going to be Michigan on the road. I think Camp Randall is going to be underrated. UW seems to struggle at UCLA for whatever reason. Michael Penix lost to UCLA. Nobody would have guessed that on your bingo card looking back in hindsight. So I think, there's always going to be that trap game. And I wonder, and that's kind of why I mentioned Jedd Fisch and all this, how does he avoid those landmines? Because the talent is there. He's basically put himself in a box where there are no excuses this season to not at least, at the bare minimum, you're talking 8-4. But really, we're talking 9-3, and then 9-3, 10-2. Are you beating Oregon? We talked about this for a segment with. That's where this team needs to show that gap. And Oregon also hasn't, shown that much improvement to the point where they can't be caught.
I love where you're going with that, but we're going to switch gears here, because there's so many exciting prospects that we need to talk about in the 2027 class that are setting game day visits, including maybe the next Bijan Robinson. And we'll get there right after a message from our good friends over at FanDuel. August 26th is officially FanDuel Futures Day, a brand new holiday for football fans who live for bold predictions and preseason hunches. For just 24 hours, FanDuel is giving you deals on NFL season predictions, so whether you're calling your MVP, eyeing a long shot division winner, or ready to crown your Super Bowl champ before Week 1 even kicks off, this is your moment. And speaking of Bijan Robinson, I think Michael Penix, Bijan Robinson, Drake London, and the Atlanta Falcons are primed to take a big step forward in the NFC South. I've got got them as my division winner. And I think that Bijan might wind up leading all running backs in rushing yards this season. If you want to go check out the odds for those and division winners, so many more things over on FanDuel, like maybe MVP, Michael Penix's over under and touchdowns. You can check all of that out over on FanDuel. So visit the FanDuel app today and start planning your futures bets now, because Futures Day is one day and one day only. FanDuel, play your game. As we jump into this 2027 class, I know for some of the real recruiting nicks out there, Bijan Robinson might be a little bit of a deep cut with his interest in Washington from back in the day. But let's talk about somebody in the 2027 class who is scheduled to come up to Washington for the Ohio State game on September 27th from Damon Williams' alma mater and four-star running back Noah Roberts, who, when you look at 247, you look at On3, a lot of them are saying he might be the best back out of Arizona since Bijan Robinson.
Which obviously is a high bar to clear, but I think even without that comparison, look at the track record Jedd Fisch and the staff have evaluating talent in the state of Arizona. Not just because, I mean, it was great circumstance that he happened to coach in Tucson, so you're looking at it and saying, hey, why not recruit the state pretty well? And they absolutely did. But we can go down the list of guys, Damon obviously being one. But you look at it and just think, they know that Scotty Graham and, getting Adam Muhammad out of the state as well knows how to, kind of just build those relationships, build those inroads. And then Jedd Fisch being kind of that CEO guy that comes in on the official visits and says, hey, look, be a pro. You kind of just really letting the coaches do, the assistant coaches do the recruiting, and he kind of makes that overarching pitch. And I think that's why, Scotty Graham, like, who doesn't want to play for Scotty Graham at this point? Like, you look and just talk to the guy. He's such a strong developer of talent, first of all. You just look at his track record. But then you just kind of, the way he recruits guys, when he zeroes in on a guy, he usually happens to get him. Look at Brian Bonner.
So that's exactly what I was going to say. And I think it's one thing where when we just kind of look at what Scotty's track record has been over the last couple of seasons, he's done a really good job. And then you look at some of those personalized videos that Washington's creative department is putting out for some of these recruits. Phenomenal idea, by the way. Hats off to whoever's idea, like whoever came up with that one. That was a truly tremendous just decision to do. It's really cool to see some of these coaches in action, even if it's, a 5-second clip of them just saying, hey, here, shout out to whoever, good luck with your season. Like, this is why you should come to Washington kind of thing. I think that's really fun. Getting the players involved in it was really cool as well. And I look at somebody like Noah in particular, you turn on that tape, man, and it really is a great combination of everything you want to see from a top tier running back: the speed, the balance, the receiving ability out of the backfield, the power that he can bring when he really needs to. It's so exciting to see Washington just continue to get in the mix for these top tier prospects and not care really about who you're just bringing in. And you mentioned Brian Bonner. That's kind of where I wanted to go with this. And I mean that as no disrespect to Brian Bonner. It's exactly what you and I have been talking about since this coaching staff got here. It's stacking classes on a year in, year out basis. And that's exactly what this would be. It's, hey, we got Brian Bonner. We love what he brings to the table. Yeah, let's still go get the best running back in the West in the 2027 class and a guy like Noah Roberts. And that's exactly what this coaching staff needs to continue to do at every single position. And it brings us to another phenomenal example from the state of Arizona and four-star wide receiver Zerek Sidney, another guy who set up a game day visit to come up here this fall.
And again, you just look at it's the track record. And for me, I think there's an interesting thing about emphasizing a state like Arizona, because you're on the West Coast. You do have that Big 12, Big 10 rivalry, but I think the Big 10 certainly has established itself as beyond the marquee conference of the two. And I think that is kind of, among the things Jedd Fisch sells when you're looking at these guys. And what game are they coming up for? A lot of them, that Ohio State game. And so that, I think, is clearly pretty obvious why that game's been circled on the calendar for a long time. But it's giving that Oregon game vibes. It's giving that, greater than Michigan State, because obviously, you beat Michigan State, a top 25 team, I believe, at the time back in 22.
That's right. But they're number 11, yeah.
Yeah, and it's kind of like it's better than that because, again, Ohio State's not, right there like they were in the national championship last year. But, it's going to be one of those games that I think could be a signature win for Jedd Fisch if he's able to pull it off.
So I disagree a little with just the Ohio State thing there, and that's why you're selling it like this. Because not only are they the defending national champs, not only do they have the two best players in college football in Jeremiah Smith and Caleb Downs, but they also are still ranked in the top 5 in the preseason, which is exactly the whole point of all this. Because the other day that we're seeing a lot of guys set up for right now, I can't remember off the top of my head who some of the ones that are coming up for is the Illinois game, where these are the two teams that you're hosting early enough to set them up now in terms of ranked opponents that are projected to be really good this year. Oregon obviously being the other one, but that one's in late November. And I feel like that might be a chance for some kids to maybe come up a second time. So I'm very curious to see how that one might play out down the line. But I look at Zerek, who's a phenomenal route runner. I look at this class and I think that you might only wind up taking 2 wide receivers after just really stacking the 25 class and then going after some high-end talent in 2026. Obviously grabbing Mason James is a really significant win for this coaching staff. And I look at Zerek and in-state wide receiver Braylon Pope as the two guys who Washington might wind up with in the 27 class. And it's just a real nice way to continue this influx of talent and stacking classes on a year in, year out basis that I, A, couldn't be more excited about, but B, I just look at the way that this coaching staff has, as you said, identified the talent. And I couldn't agree more with where they're going, especially with a guy like Zerek, who, like I said, is a phenomenal route runner and just kind of reminds me a lot of Desmond Roebuck in the way that he's just able to create space on such a consistent basis. And I love what he brings to the table. And I think that this is the guy who really does fit in that in-out mold of what Kevin Cummings and Jedd Fisch and Jimmy Doherty want to do, where you can line him up in the slot, you can line him up in the Z, and you'd be more than happy with him in either position.
And I think when you broke all that down, very good points, by the way, it made me think back to how this year's class came together, where you had, who was it? Terrence Sarian commit early on and then end up, switching his career to BYU. Where does that in-state versus, we're looking at some of the top guys nationally battle kind of play in there? Because if Pope's able to make that commitment by, let's say November, it's kind of what Sarian did and a few other guys, when you look at the Van Spafford commitment nationally, that's usually when the guys in next year's class tend to make their commitments, November, December, potentially January. If UW is able to shore up their class by then, fantastic. And I think that's kind of why Jedd's aiming so big with these visits is, hey, let's get them on campus early. Let's build those relationships. So you know what? At least we're in that discussion and maybe we get an early commitment if we kind of, strike lightning in a bottle.
Yeah, and that's one thing that I'm really curious about is who is that first commitment going to be? I know we got a couple other players that we wanted to bring up before we switch sides of the ball here. And the one for me that I'm curious about is Sione Kaho, the quarterback from Lincoln High School down in Tacoma. And I think this is the kind of guy who he can be the building block of this class, where we look at the last couple of years and, we look at Derek Coleman-Brusa, who obviously has become a cornerstone of a very strong overall class. When you look across every position, there are guys that you can point to and say, if that guy's a starter in, year 2, or maybe even for a couple of guys in year 1, I'm not going to be shocked. And I feel like Sione, while, we'll see how the quarterback position plays out long-term after DeMond leaves, is the perfect player to just have everybody rally around in terms of 4-star, in-state guy who's got a whole bunch of offers from the area where Stanford's gotten involved. I know Oregon is right there as a school he's really considering. And if Washington can win that battle of a lot of the, premier West Coast brands, you can really build a class around that. And then all of a sudden, Reese Russell, the 4-star offensive lineman from Colorado, who's shown he's really high on Washington. Maybe he says, oh yeah, that's the kind of guy I want to play with. Or, maybe Braylon Pope, an in-state receiver, Jacoba Doyle, an in-state offensive lineman. There are so many talents that might just kind of flock to Washington once that quarterback commits.
And but it's interesting because I don't disagree with that, but just when you look at the 26 class, it was offensive line before it was quarterback in a way, where you looked at some of the guys that you had identified, and it's, for me, a guy like Ben Lother from Centennial High School in Arizona, hotbed for UW in the past with Dominic Hampton, plenty of other names to go around there. That's a guy where I wouldn't be surprised if maybe you get an offensive line commit, and then you look at Noah Roberts, you look at the quarterback position, receivers, et cetera, and then it's like, oh wait, that guy wants to commit. That might be where I look more so than some other schools. And I think that, again, keeping the theme with the Big Ten, get bigger, faster, stronger. Jedd Fisch has been emphasizing the trenches at nauseam, especially the offensive line. Why not make that your first commit? And Michael Switzer hit it pretty well in 25, or in 26, so why not 27 as well?
Lars, let's jump over to the defensive side of the ball because there are some big-time talents that Washington's in on along the defensive line. And we'll get to that right after a message from our friends over at Rugiet. Guys, you've probably heard of Viagra or Cialis. Maybe you've even tried them. But if you're looking for something beyond the usual pill, it's time to meet Rugiet Ready. Rugiet Ready is a next-gen prescription treatment designed to amplify arousal in the brain and boost blood flow. Unlike the usual pills that can take hours, Rugiet's 3-in-1 formula dissolves under your tongue and kicks in fast. On average, in 15 minutes. Effects can last up to 36 hours, so you can stay confident and in control when the moment is right. If traditional options haven't worked, Rugiet might be the answer. Over 150,000 men have already made the switch. Head to Rugiet.com/LockdownCollege and use code LockdownCollege to get 15% off today. That's RUGIET.com/LockdownCollege and use promo code LockdownCollege for 15% off. Individual results may vary with prescription treatment. Compounded drugs are permitted to be prescribed under federal law but are not FDA approved and do not undergo FDA safety, effectiveness, or manufacturing review. Please visit the Rugiet website for full safety information. So as we jump over to the defensive side, the number one question is defensive line, and more specifically, especially as you look at the depth chart, edge rusher. And there's one guy who I wanted to highlight. I know I brought his name up on a show the other day. It's Sooner edge rusher Troy Bowens, who's a 2027 prospect, 4-star. He's listed as an edge rusher, might wind up playing interior defensive line depending on the scheme, where he's like a true 3-4 defensive end right now. But he's just a big, powerful athlete, 6'4", 250 pounds. And this is the kind of guy who not only do I think fits really well in this Ryan Walters defensive scheme, but is just exactly the kind of player that this coaching staff needs to win out for, where he doesn't have necessarily a whole bunch of national offers at this point in time. A lot of schools in the West Coast have definitely taken notice of what he brings to the table. But I look at what we need to see, especially out of defensive line coach Jason Kafusi in this 2027 recruiting cycle, and hitting on a couple of these big-time edge rushers that you missed out on in 2026 is really important.
So as I was kind of looking down the 247 offer list, obviously Troy Bowens would be a massive get. Almost every time I hear Bowens, I think Bowers, and I think Bowers, oh, Brock, what could have been. But with that being said, you look at 2 New Jersey products. Like, I don't disagree with any, but the key thing you hit on there was, the West Coast thing. There's a lot of national offers going out to some of these guys where you have offers in Texas, New Jersey, Colorado. You're going basically all over the country to find where the talent is. So I think it clearly tells you what the messages from this 27 class for Jason Kafusi and company, where you have to go find where the talent is and just go get the best talent. Like, forget trying to play the nickel and dime, hey, we're going to see what happens in 2 or 3 years. Maybe he'll round into his body. You can take a Victor Sanchez Hernandez and, certain guys that are maybe under the radar a couple of years, but you really start to need to load up in this class. And so I think when you look down just overall at that offer list, that's kind of what this class is sending.
How do I put this best? I think that there's a lot from the 2026 class that certainly did come down to talent evaluations and then valuations at a certain point too, where I think Washington did a really good job with, some of these players going above and beyond to get Derek Coleman, Bruce, T.I. Umukais. I think they did a really good job of making sure that, hey, we love what this player brings to the table. We are going to make sure that we are as competitive as possible. And if there were certain other players out there who maybe, were demanding a certain amount more in NIL or something like that, and Washington said, you know what, we're comfortable with letting you go somewhere else, I feel like that's something that should just be thrown out there. But I look at, the reason I wanted to tie all this together is Troy Bowens is a perfect example of that kind of guy right now, where you look at what he brings to the table before, some of these other schools in the Big Ten, a little bit further east might want to get involved, is you have an opportunity to not necessarily secure this guy at a steal, is the way that I would say this, but offer him a price that you can't refuse. Plus, on top of that, there are so many things about playing at Washington that I think, especially along the defensive line, should be incredibly intriguing for a lot of these top prospects on the West Coast, where this is why I say that these are the kinds of battles that this coaching staff needs to win. And it's not just showing that you can pony up the resources for the guys that are at the top of your board, which again, we've seen that they can certainly do that when need be. But at the same time, it's overextending early on to make sure that you get some of these guys in the boat where, let's say it gets to November, December, and they really love the evaluation that they have on Troy Bowens or Elija Harmon, the guy I want to get to next. I think that it's something where this coaching staff needs to show that they can just continue to compete at that level with whoever else might be coming in for these prospects, whether it's the Alabamas and the Georgias and the LSUs of the world, where I know I'm taking that to an extreme level, but that's exactly, again, where it should be. And the Michigans, the Ohio States in the same light, where if this coaching staff, which we know they do, if they want to compete with the top teams in the country in terms of doling it out and recruiting every single season, you need to make sure you wrap up these guys that you are super high on in the evaluations process early.
And I think the key thing to remember in all this, much like going into last year for different reasons, was players don't necessarily know what it's going to look like. So I think for a guy like Troy Bowens, how does that edge position look in Ryan Walters' defense at Washington? Obviously, Ryan Walters can say, hey, I did this, that, and the other thing at Purdue, Missouri, Illinois, name a stop. Ryan Walters has killed it. So it's not like players don't believe in him. Obviously, Troy Bowens has high interest in Washington, Elija Harmon, a few others that you're going to mention here. But once the players see it, and especially when they get on campus for a game day visit, I think that is really when, that September, late September, October, November kind of window is really going to push Washington into that upper conversation with a lot of these elite prospects.
So let's talk about another one of those elite prospects in Elija Harmon, 4-star defensive tackle from Inglewood High School in Southern California. This is a guy I don't necessarily feel the same way about T.I. Mukai's tape that I do with his, where I think T.I. is a little bit more refined as a pass rusher, which is one of the reasons that you and I were so high on him so early in the process. But I look at a guy like Elija Harmon and what he brings right now, in similarly to T.I. as a high floor run defender, as someone who is really good at just plugging gaps in the run, is able to get home with some bull rushes and some power at different points of time. If you can continue to just refine that, and I know that in the personalized video Jason Kafusi did for him, he hinted that he's been dealing with a little bit of an injury recently. If you can figure that out and just get into shape very quickly during his junior season and just return to form, this is the kind of guy who already has reeled in some of those big time offers. And again, you missed out on so many of those top prospects last season who committed really early, whether it be to USC or, Ohio State, obviously, who came in and took Kari Wilder, one of the top prospects on Washington's board in the 26 class. If you can reel in commitments from those guys early on in the process, Elija Harmon is one name that I would watch as just someone that we know this coaching staff is really interested in, and is someone who could certainly make a big time impact early on in his career.
And I think it's just a matter of it. I see that's the kind of thing that we've learned about Jason Kafusi is he's a relationship coach. And I know that it's not going to, sound great and all this, but it truly is true. When you remember Devin Hyde's conversation that we had with him, and you just hear the guys in the room, Tai Uengle, when we got to talk to him and after practice a couple of times, they've all hinted at it where once you get to know him, like you love to play for him, but sometimes, guys might not get to know him. And I think that's why these early visits are so imperative, because players getting around him and the other staff to be worth to bring it home. Aaron Van Horn, new coach, all those sorts of things. Getting the players around the coaches on a game day, that is imperative, and kind of nothing replaces it. I think that's, when you look at off-season visits, kind of worth clarifying on this one. When you have the game day visit, a lot of times you don't get to see a ton of things. It's just the experience. Sometimes, you have the relationship visits in the off-season, January, very much, but it starts on a game day visit. And that Oregon game kind of planted every seed that we now see growing.
So let's talk about another one of those game day visitors, and that's a 3-star athlete, Bode Sparrow. Phenomenal name, by the way, a truly elite name, from Utah, who is a really intriguing two-way prospect. And the way that you and I wanted to kind of wrap all this up was talking about not just him, but I know there are a couple other safeties that we've talked about recently on the show, including 4-star Isala Eso Wiliava, who is going to be coming up for, I believe it's the Ohio State game, but Bode, who's coming up for the Illinois game. I'm very interested to get your take on this, because I think that getting a lot of these guys just kind of interested early in securing these visits now, especially at safety, I think there are going to be a lot of people who, and we talked about this the last time we talked about the 27 class and just seeing how many safeties were interested in Washington early on. I think that it's a big testament to Ryan Walters and what he does with safeties in this defense. And because, we've seen 3 safeties on the field for a decent period of time during fall camp, but it's also a big testament to Taylor Mays, who this is the, perfect time to get him into coaching and get him into recruiting in general, because he's the kind of guy for a lot of these kids where I'm sure if we were able to get some of them on the show and talk to them about Taylor, it's, oh yeah, this is a guy who I grew up watching play safety and watching his highlight tape and different things like that because of just the impact that he was able to make at USC.
And a guy that you still look at today making an impact with Ryland Dillard Allen. I think obviously we know Ryland has talent, but I just think when I agree completely, you look at that level of coaching. First of all, Duke could still play today if he really needed to strap up the laces. Like Taylor May looks very much like he could play safety in the NFL still today if he really, really wanted to, and if injuries maybe went a certain way. But I think that's kind of why Jedd was able to tap him. And you look at pairing him with John Richardson, a well-established secondary coach, and Ryan Walters, it's the perfect opportunity for Taylor to kind of soak in both of their coaching, but also still use his playing background and say, hey, I can talk the talk and walk the walk. And I mean, when you're a player, like that's invaluable, man. Like that's some guy you really want to play for.
No, that exactly. And that's probably the perfect thing to wrap this up on is when we talk to CJ Christian, when we talk to Alex McLaughlin, all of the safeties we've gotten a chance to speak to just throughout his first season as a position coach, they've said the exact same thing. It's, yeah, we know who he is, not just in terms of what he brings to the table as a coach. And we really enjoy, the way he communicates with us because of exactly what you said, but it's, we know that he has done this at the highest level. And that is something that, as you said, is just incredibly invaluable with a lot of these guys. And I'm really curious to see how it's going to pay off with the rest of this 27 class. Lars, as always, thank you so much for being here. Thank you to all everydayers tuning in. We really do appreciate your support. We got so much more fun stuff coming for you throughout the season. So please make sure you subscribe wherever you get your podcast, whether that's YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music. We're there. We're everywhere. We're updating this channel with new content every single day. So please make sure you click that like button, click that little bell so as we post a new show. Plus, if you're on the audio only side of things, please make sure to leave us a 5-star review, as it does help us out a lot. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll talk to you on Monday.